All right, I will say good morning. Let us begin. We have an incredible daf ahead of us today to thank our sponsor, our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Teves, Yoel and Sara Kelman, in honor of the birth of their daughter Oriya Tahel and the schus that all of those who are davening for this beautiful bracha of children should be granted at Bekarov. To thank Teri Czinn for dedicating the Shurim this month in honor of their grandchildren, Adin, Tzvi and Naftali, Moshe, and Shirley Elbaum Family, creation of the yahrzeit of Gerald Elbaum, Yaakov Kopel and R Avraham Menachem. We hope that under the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshama will have an aliyah and the family a nechama. And also with that, we're going to have a lot to do today. Today's daf is Daf Ches. Daf Ches. We are picking up on Zayin Amud Beis 7b. We left off at the last Mishnah on the daf, in the middle of what we call the Ein Bein Sugyos. The Ein Bein Sugyos, meaning there's the Mishnayos that contrast two different things. So also we're picking up on the last Mishnah on 7b, Zayin Amud Beis 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 13 lines up from the bottom. Mishnah. Ein Bein Shabbos Yom Kippurim. There is no difference between Shabbos and Yom Kippur. Elo shezeh zedona b'dei Adam, v'zeh zedona b'kares. The only distinction that there lies between the two of them is that violation of Shabbos is punishable b'dei Adam. One could be executed in a Beis Din if he violates Shabbos. V'zeh zedona b'kares. Whereas violation of Yom Kippur is kares. Of course, kares refers to death at the hands of heaven and all of the other associated aspects of kares. Says the Gemara, what he sees something interesting. Hal le'inyan tashlumin zeh v'zeh shavin. But say what you see is that when it comes to tashlum, when it comes to compensation, we'll discuss the exact parameters of that case in just a moment. Yom Kippur and Shabbos are the same. So the Gemara says, Mani Masnis, and whose opinion is this? Listen to this. Rabbi Nechunya ben Akanahi. The Sanya, so we'll say, let me just tell you this out for just a moment. One of the fascinating concepts in halacha is the concept of kimle b'derabimine. I'll give you a simple example. Reuven goes over to Shimon's field on Shabbos, and he burns down the field. He burns down Shimon's field. So the Shayla Rabosai in halacha is, what is the nature of Reuven's liability? You see, on one hand, remember again, think about this. The act of burning down a field, of course, Reuven has caused Shimon monetary damages. But what else has happened over here? What else has happened? Reuven has also violated Shabbos, right? Havara. Kindling a fire on Shabbos is an Isser Da'araisa, and if done intentionally, again, with witnesses and warning, carries a death penalty. So the Shaila in Halacha is, what happens when you perform an act which simultaneously generates a capital liability and a financial liability? So generally in Halacha, there's the concept of Kimle B'derabamine, which if you do something that gets you the death penalty, it exempts you from any associated financial liability as well. That's the concept. So therefore, also watch this. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Chuy ben Akana, the sign, Rabbi Chuy ben Akana, Haya Oses Yom Kippur Kishabbos L'Tashlumin. Rabbi Chuy ben Akana said, Yom Kippur is just like Shabbos, therefore, for compensatory damages. Mas Shabbos, Mischai Benafsho Patim Min HaTashlumin. Just like on Shabbos, if halacha l'maisa, you do something which gets you the death penalty and also financial damages, the death penalty exempts you from financial damages. Af Yom Kippurim mischai b'nafsho patur min hatashlumin. So too again on Yom Kippur, same idea. If a person goes ahead of us, so the simple case in Yom Kippur would be Reuven goes over to Shimon and he goes ahead and he eats his loaf of bread. Right? He eats his artisan loaf of bread, which is worth a lot of money. So what happens now? Same idea. Reuven is two levels of liability. One, he's chayiv kares for eating on Yom Kippur. Number two, he stole, and therefore he's chayiv for financial damages. So Rabbi Chuy ben Akana said, just like on Shabbos, kimle b'derabimine, since you're obligating the death penalty, you only get the death penalty and are exempted from financial compensation or financial repayment. So too on Yom Kippur is the same halacha. Very interesting idea. So the Gemara says, Tznan Hasam, Kol Chave Krisus Shalako Niftru Midei Krisasan. But it's an interesting Mishnah. The Mishnah says, in general, if you chayv kares, I will say, kares is one of these interesting things. Because kares, of course, is a punishment that is not, what's the word? Not delivered, but is not, administered, thank you, is not administered by an earthly court, right? Kares is a punishment by a Kadosh Baruch Hu. So listen to this Mishnah. The Mishnah says if a person does something which carries a liability of kares, what's the halacha? if that person gets malchus, lashes, nifteru midei krisasan. Ultimately, again, they are exempted from their kares. Look at Rashi, almost right across. Kol chavi krisus, no, that's not yet, sorry. A little bit above. I'm sorry. Kol chavi krisus shalako shehizru bahan edim alav she'imo kares velako bebezdin nifteru midei krisasan shuv ein bezdin shamalo nifra'in. We'll say fascinating halacha. So a person does something that carries liability of kares. If halacha l'maaseh they get malchus, the malchus exempts them from the kares, which I will say is pretty wild if you think about it. Why? Because what's happening over here? A punishment in Beis Din shel mata, right? In earthly Beis Din is exempting them from liability in celestial Beis Din, which is an excellent deal, excellent deal, right? This is wonderful that this is indeed halacha because it's worth, the malchus are worth it. The malchus are worth it. So the Gemara says, Shnei Amar, how do you know this? V'nikla achicha le'inecha. Because the pasuk says literally, your brother, the Torah over here is talking about the idea that we never give more than 39 malchus. You never administer more than 39 lashes. That's the maximum amount. Because the pasuk says, because if you give him more lashes, v'nikla achicha le'inecha, you could disparage your brother in your eyes. So what do you see from here? Kevan shalaka, once a person is flogged, once a person receives their lashes in Beis Din, harehu ke'achicha, he once again becomes like your brother. The fact that the Torah calls him achicha, your brother will say, tells you that what? That malchus is restorative. Right? Malchus is restorative. That the administering of lashes restores him to the state of achicha. Divrei Rabbi Hananya ben Gamliel. These are the words of Rabbi Hananya ben Gamliel. But I just want to also point out something amazing. We've mentioned this many times in the past, but in general, in halacha and in Yiddishkeit in general, we don't have the concept of punitive punishments. Punishments are always rehabilitative. They're always rehabilitative. That's why in Judaism, we have no concept of jail. There's no jail system in Judaism, because Judaism understood long ago that putting someone in a cell for a prolonged period of time does not help them get over their problems. This is not like a chiddush. Caging someone like an animal for a prolonged amount of time does not somehow cure anything. Often, as we see in contemporary society, makes things worse. See, even malchus, you begin to see malchus. Now, again, I will point out, is there punitive punishment in Judaism? I just said there's no punitive. Is there punitive punishment in Judaism? There's something called the knas, right? Knas, which is in the realm of financial payments. You have payments that are penalty payments, right? They have nothing, they have really nothing to do, right? I go ahead and I steal a sheep, and I slaughter it and I sell it. I have to pay back 4 times the value of the sheep. What's that? That's a knas. That's a penalty. So in the realm of financial obligation or financial penalties, you have knas, you have punitive. But in the realm of other types of punishment, you don't have it. So it's amazing. Malchus. What's the point of malchus? So malchus, the Gemara says, is restorative. The idea of malchus is you go and you give him malchus, and once you give him malchus, what happens? He's achicha. He's once again your brother. So the Gemara says as follows. Rabbi Hananya ben Gamliel. Rabbi Yochanan says, if you think about this, by the way, this is really a dramatic and beautiful idea, which is that even if a person is chayiv kares, if he gets malchus, the malchus themselves have the ability to restore him to his yid status, to his achicha status. Rabbi Yochanan says, Chalukin al Chavera Rabbi Hananya ben Gamliel. So Rabbi Yochanan says, by the way, just so you should know, not everyone agrees with Rabbi Hananya ben Gamliel, right? And there are many who say that halacha l'maisa, administering malchus does not free one from the penalty of kares. Amar Rava says, Amri Bei Rav Chanina, Amri Bei Rav Tanina, so we'll say, so that's just the side piece. Tanina, Ein Yom Kippur M'Shabbos, Ella, Shezeh Zedona B'di Adam, V'zeh Zedona B'di Kares. Remember again, we just said, we'll say, now let's bring this back to the Mishnah. What did the Mishnah say? There's no distinction between Shabbos and Yom Kippur. It's just that violation of Shabbos is judged in a human court, and violation of Yom Kippur is Kares B'dei Shamayim. So the Gemara says, 1 second, Vim Isa, but 1 second, if it's true, that even if you're chayiv kares, we'll say, what happens if you're chayiv kares? What do we do if you're chayiv kares? What do we do? We give you malchus. in Beis Din. Because this way, again, that exempts you from your kares. If that's true, idi v'idi b'dei adam. then both Shabbos and Yom Kippur are both bidei Adam, right? Because remember again, that means even if I violate Yom Kippur, and therefore there's a chi of kares, what are they going to do to me? What are they going to do to me? They're going to flog me in Beis Din and give me malchus. Now the bad news is I get malchus. The good news is the malchus absolved me from my kares. But if that's true, then in reality, both Shabbos and Yom Kippur are both judged in an earthly court. The truth is, the Mishnah reflects the view of Rabbi Yitzchak. He holds that halacha l'maisa, malchus in chayvei, there is no malchus in chayvei krisos. So Rabbi Yitzchak does not subscribe to this idea. He doesn't hold to that. He holds that wherever there's kares, human courts don't do anything for kares infractions. That is up to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Disan Rabbi Yitzchak Omer, chayvei krisos bechlal hayu. So in general, if you look at Rashi says, Kol chayvei krisos, shal arayos hayu bechlal, v'nichresu hanefashos ha'osos. Rabbi say in general, for arayos, for acts of immorality, kind of all acts of immorality are grouped together under the umbrella of kares. So the Gemara says, if that's the case, V'lama yatzes kares ba'achoso. So if that's the case, why does the Torah single out an act of immorality with one's sister? In other words, if we have a generic statement that talks about arayos, and we understand that even incest with one's sister is included in that, why does the Torah have to single out incest with one's sister? Ladona b'kares v'lo b'malchus, to teach us ultimately again that halacha l'maaseh only gets kares and not malchus. Rav Ashi, so therefore again, so remember what we have over here unfolding is as follows. In general, where there is a chi of kares, do you get malchus or not? So clearly, what do we begin to see? It's a machlokas, and the Gemara is just suggesting the author of our Mishnah holds that when there's a chi of kares, there are no malchus. There is no malchus. There is no malchus. That's why the Mishnah says the distinction between Shabbos and Yom Kippur is that Yom Kippur is judged by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? Because there are no malchus, it's kares. And Shabbos is judged in an earthly court. Rav Ashi says, Afilutim Rabbanam. The truth is, the Mishnah could even reflect the view of the one who holds that you do get malchus even for a kares bearing infraction. Afilutim Rabbanam. Ze ikar zadona b'di adam. Ze ikar zadona b'di kares. The Mishnah could just be read as a distinction between Shabbos and Yom Kippur. It will say, even if you hold that kares gets malchus in Beis Din, at the end of the day, the essence of the punishment is still bidei shamayim. It's still in the hands of heaven. So Rabbi say just two different ways of reading the Mishnah. The Mishnah could really be reflective of either view. Rabbi say, I will just point out that the Rambam paskins halacha l'maisa like Rabbi Yitzchak, namely that if a person violates a kares infraction, they do get malchus in Beis Din Shal Mata. They do get malchus. They do get lashes in earthly Beis Din. And ultimately, God will say the good news is that those malchus, if you think about it, by the way, you also need it from, it appears that has to be the halacha just from a societal perspective. You never want to have a system where people could violate serious infractions and there's no ramification in the Beis Din system. So almost like it's a mechanism to keep people honest that there's a punishment for everything, right? Most of us live life making decisions based on the consequences of those decisions. So the idea that even if you violate a kares-bearing infraction, there is still a punishment here in Beis Din Shal Mata. But again, that's how he paskin, that if you violate kares, halacha l'maisa, there are malchus in Beis Din Shal Mata, but the good news is those malchus absolve you of the kares. So I will say again, to close it out, therefore the Mishnah says, in general, Shabbos and Yom Kippur are the same in terms of the nature of the restrictions, leaving aside the fasting restrictions on Yom Kippur, so not the malacha restrictions. Just the distinction, violation of Shabbos is dealt with in an earthly court, violation of Yom Kippur is dealt with by the celestial court. Top of Ches. Ein bein, hamudir hana mechavero, lemodir amenu ma'achol. So let's listen to this. This is a case we'll say. By the way, it's actually exciting. Those of us who are doing Mishnah Yomi, so it's nice because you saw all of these Mishnayos ahead of time. One of the advantages of doing the Mishnayos before you do the Masechtas, you get a little bit of a familiarity. So we've seen this case already. The Mudra Haname Chaberabo says the following case. This is a situation where I make a neder that Ruvain is not permitted to get benefit from me. Right? It says an interesting Mudar Hana'a Mechaber. I'm making a neder preventing someone else from getting any benefit from me. So the Mishnah here is talking about two different types of nedarim. So the first type is, I take a neder, I say, Ruvain, I hereby take a neder, preventing you from getting any benefit from any of my possessions. You can't get any benefit from anything belonging to me. Versus neder number two is, you can't get benefit from any of my food items. Any of my food items. So the Gemara Mishnah says, the only distinction between those two nedarim is Ela Drisas Haregel. So listen to this. This is quite fascinating. In general, right? So is Reuben allowed to take a shortcut through my property? So the Gemara says, well, it depends. What does it depend on? The type of neder. If I only precluded Reuven from getting benefit from my food items, then he could take a shortcut. However, if it's general neder against getting benefit from me, he can't even take a shortcut. The kelim shein osem behind ochal nefesh. Same idea about utensils not used for the preparation of food. If it's a general benefit, if neder precluding general benefit, he can't use those kelim. But if it's just food related, he can use those kelim. Says the Gemara, Hal inyan kelim she'osin b'han ochal nefesh zev zeh shaven. But obviously, when it comes to utensils used for the actual creation of food, then no matter what the neder, he'll be precluded from using it. Now, it's very interesting. Drisas haregos. Remember again, the Mishnah said, listen to this. If I make a neder saying, Ruvain, you are not permitted to get any benefit from me, right? What is Ruvain not allowed to do? He can't take a shortcut across my lawn. Even though for the last 20 years, everyone else in the world walks across my lawn, right? Reuven is not permitted to walk across my lawn. The Gemara says, halo kapti inshi, but in general we assume that people don't mind if you take a shortcut across their property. And I both say, now that's a very open-ended statement, because people very often do mind if you take we're talking about a situation where it's understood that the person in question over here doesn't mind if you take a shortcut through their property. So a person is not makbid. What do you see from here? Amar Rava Hamani, Rabbi Eliezer da Amar, Vitor Asr B'moder Hana. Well, so it's actually really quite fascinating. In general, we assume that there are certain things that a person is mevater on. Right? Certain things that a person just is not, what's the right word, mevater? Yielding. Right? There's a better word. That a person gives general permission for, right? Certain things that a person just is not makbid on. It's maybe the better way to say it. I'm just not makbid. So one of the examples of that is, you want to take a little shortcut across my lawn? Fine. It doesn't. A person's not makbid. So the interesting thing we see from here, Rabbi Eliezer is of the opinion, however, if I'm making a neder, and the neder is, you are not allowed to get benefit from me, what does that neder include? What does that neder include? Everything. Pretty much, it even includes the things that people are not normally makbid on. Right? And it makes sense. Why? Because if I'm going out of my way to what? To make a neder, saying that you can't get benefit from me, so b'pashtos, that includes everything, even the things that a person would not normally be makbid on. So normally I don't mind if somebody takes a detour, right, a shortcut across my lawn, that's fine. But if I'm going out of my way to make a neder, saying that you can't get benefit from me, the pashtos, it includes those things as well. Incredible. Ein bein nedarim lenedavas, next Mishnah, but these are great. Ein bein nedarim lenedavas, ella shan nedarim chayav b'achri yuson, unedavas enu chayav b'achri yuson. So we'll say, very interesting Mishnah. Normally, nedarim and nedavas are grouped together. A neder is a vow, right, and a nedava is a gift. Now, I will say, let's just frame this in the realm of karbanos. That's the easiest way to deal with this, right? So there are two types of offerings a person can bring. I hereby vow to bring a shlamim. Let's just use that. Or, right, that's a neder. Or nedava is I'm bringing this shlamim as a nedava, a gift offering. So the Mishnah says, in reality, right, like halachically, it's the same carbon. It's not really such a big difference. The major difference lies in what? Liability if something happens to the carbon. Namely, I will say, if halacha lamaisa, I made a neder, if I made a vow, so I made a vow to offer up this sheep as a shlamim. If something happens to the sheep, then what? I am obligated to replace it. Versus a nedava of gift, if something happens to the sheep, I am not obligated to replace it. I will say a very simple distinction that we'll see in the Gemara, which is what? Is the difference between a chiyav on the gavra versus the cheftza. A neder is a chiv on the gavra, is a chiv on me. I have taken upon myself a responsibility. So therefore, I do not fulfill the responsibility until when? Until I bring the carbon. If the first animal dies, I have to replace it. Second animal dies, third animal dies, no matter what happens, I have to make sure that carbon gets there. Nidava is not an obligation on the gavra. What is a nidava? Nidava on the cheftza. I'm designating an object, and therefore the obligation devolves upon the object. Therefore, should something happen to the designated animal, halacha l'maisa, I have no further responsibility. Says the Gemara, hala inyan bal ta'acher. Yet Rabbi say, interesting when it comes to bal ta'acher. Remember again, what's bal ta'acher? Bal ta'acher is the biblical obligation not to delay fulfilling your obligations. That if you make a promise to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you make a pledge, you have to go ahead and honor it in a timely fashion. So the Gemara says, you see from here that whether you made a neder or a nedava, you have an obligation to honor it in a timely fashion. So Tanan Hasam, here we see, Ezehu neder, right? What's a neder? Ha'omer hare alai ola. Rabbi say here, this frames even more clear. What's a neder? A person says, I hereby take upon myself the obligation for Allah. So what am I doing? Alai. It's an obligation which rests upon me. Ezohi nedava. What's a nedava? Harezu ola. Ultimately, again, this is Rabbi say, you see the distinction? Neder, hare alai. It's an obligation upon me. A nedava, harezu. The obligation, quote unquote, is on the animal. Not really. It's not the obligation is on the animal. The obligation is still on me. But the responsibility is vested within that object. Therefore, what's the halacha? What's the distinction between a neder and a dava? Nidarim meisu o nignevu by neder. If the animal dies or is stolen, or avdu or is lost, chai b'achriyusan. I, the owner, am obligated to replace it. Because remember again, it's hare alai. The obligation is upon me. Nedavos, however, when it comes to nedavos, meisu o nignevu o avdu. If it dies, it's stolen or it's lost, eno chai b'achriyusan. I am not obligated to replace it. Why? Because remember again, the obligation was vested in that particular animal. Once that animal dies, disappears, is stolen, I no longer have an obligation to replace it. Incredible. How do we know this? So Rabbi Shimon Omer, es she'alav chai ba'achriyusan, ve'es she'eno alav, eno chai ba'achriyusan. It is only that which is upon you, only an obligation which is on you, that you have achrayus if something happens to the original animal. But ultimately, again, if the obligation is not upon you, then halacha l'maisa, if something happens, you have no replacement obligation. My mashma, how do you say this in the pasuk? Kevan da amar alai. See, I will say when a person says the word alai, I write hare alai ola. The obligation is upon me. Kiman getoin akasve dami. It is as if the obligation sits on your shoulders. Says Rabbi say, we've seen this distinction many times throughout our journeys through Shas. The simple and fundamental distinction between neder and nidava. Neder hare alai, the obligation is upon me. Nidava hare zu, this animal is going to be offered as a carbon. Nafkamina between alai and zu, something happens to the designated animal. If the obligation is alai, then I have an obligation to bring as many animals as I need to until I fulfill my obligation, which is upon me. Hare zu, ultimately, again, if something happens to the designated animal, I no longer have a particular obligation. Incredible. So let's go right there. Let's go right. You know, it's also interesting. It's also interesting to see that in life, there are also these different kinds of responsibilities, right? There are neder responsibilities and there are nedava responsibilities. If you think about it, right? That in life there are certain things that are hare alai, certain things that are my responsibility. They're my obligation. And I will say, if something is your obligation, then what's the halacha? You got to get it done. You have to get it done. In other words, there are no excuses. And even if there are excuses, that's fine, right? Figure it out, right? So, in other words, remember, the guy who says, hare alai ola, and the animal dies, that's a pretty legitimate excuse not to bring the carbon. And what does Allah say to him? So sorry for your loss, right? So sorry for your loss. I'm sure you were tight with that sheep, right? But now it's time to go ahead and find a replacement and get the job done. So in life, there are neder responsibilities. If something is upon me to get done, there are no excuses. There are no outs. I have to get the job done. But in life, there are also neder situations. And I will say, what are neder situations? Sometimes something in life has to get done, but it's not necessarily my responsibility. And so if possible, I have to do it, but then there are times where I have to absent myself from the process, perhaps because I just can't get sucked into something that is not really on me. We see this all the time. There are things that are important, but they may not be my responsibility. And often we kind of find the yahrzeit. There's a yahrzeit to try to fix the world. You can't fix the world. And often you can't fix things over which you don't have complete control. So those are like the neder type things. They're important. They have to get done. And if I can do it, I should try to do it. But if something happens which precludes me from doing it, I have to move on. Neder responsibilities are all mine. And they're both say, what the danger of neder responsibilities are? Sometimes with neder responsibilities, I look for others to do it, right? You have to do your part. If it's a neder, harei alai, it's mine and mine alone. Own it and get it done. And life is all about kind of being able to distinguish between what's a neder responsibility that I have achrayus for, that I have to get done, versus what is a nedava responsibility, which is I should try to help, but at the end of the day, I don't hold the keys. And because I don't hold the keys, perhaps again I have to figure out how much effort and how much ishtadlus I put in this particular area. Incredible life, Yisrael. More to say about that, but we still have Gemara to do. Says the Mishnah, Ein bein zav. But say, I know, many of you told me last week that you missed zav. You've missed zav, right? It's been a while since the zav has made an appearance on the Daf Yomi stage. Well, good news for you, right? There's going to be plenty of zav to go around. So says the Mishnah, that didn't sound right. But you understand, I meant there's going to be sugya over here. Good. I'm going to stick to the script. Okay, says the Mishnah, Ein bein zav. So listen to this. So very quickly. Zav is this man who has this emission. This is a non-seminal emission. So the Mishnah will say, the halacha says like this. A Zav who has two emissions, right? It doesn't matter, by the way, if it's two emissions on 2 days, two emissions on 1 day. A Zav who has two emissions, but again, they can't be two emissions over 3 days, right? It has to be either 1 day or 2 days. Has to keep Shiva Nakim, 7 clean days. 7 clean days. A Zav, well, let's see. Ein ben a Zav rosh shtei re'iyos, the rosh shalosh ela carbon. So I will say, interesting enough, whether a Zav had 2 re'iyos, right, either 2 on 1 day or 2 on 2 days, or a Zav had 3 re'iyos, which could be 3 on 1 day, 3 on 2 days, or 3 on 3 days. The halacha is both of them have to keep Shiva Nakiyim. They both have to keep 7 days. In addition, the Mishnah says, the Zav who has 3 re'iyos also has to bring a carbon as part of his purification process. So it says the Gemara, Hal inyan mishkav u'moshav usfiras shiva zev ezeh shavin. You see, I both say that halacha l'maisa. Ultimately, again, for mishkav u'moshav, so we'll say, look at Rashi. Rashi's mishkav u'moshav, shachav o yashav al gabe asara bigadim ze al ze kulan avos hatuma. Vafila lo naga bahen. Vilu naga b'davar she'el mishkav u'moshav. Ain't supposed to listen to this. The halacha of mishkav u'moshav says like this: if a zav sits on something, he transmits tuma to the item he sits on. Not only that, but imagine the following case: imagine a zav sits on a pile of cushions. The halacha of mishkav u'moshav says anything that is underneath the zav contracts his tuma. Even though what? He's not coming directly in touch with it, right? In contact with it. That's called mishkav u'moshav. Shabbos say, interesting of the Mishnah says the only distinction between a zav who has 2 emissions versus 3 emissions is carbon. But for mishkav u'moshav, tuma mishkav u'moshav, or counting of 7 clean days, they are the same. So I mean, how do you know this? So it says the Gemara, the Tan Rabban, Rabbi Simai Omer, Mana kasav shtayim v'karu tameh. So the Torah tells me that the Zav could have 2 re'iyos and he's tameh, shalosh akaro tameh, and 3 re'iyos and he's also tameh. Hakate. So that's supposed to say, so what does this mean? Shtayim l'tumah v'shalosh akarman. It tells you that once he has 2 re'iyos, right, 2 emissions, he's tameh and has to count shiva nikiyim, right? And 3 re'iyos, same thing, tameh shiva nikiyim, and also brings a carbon. Why don't you say 2 emissions is tuma and no carbon? 3 re'iyos is carbon, no tuma. Says it doesn't make sense. Amrit ad shelo ra'a shalosh ra'ashtayim. I'll say it doesn't make sense, because remember again, if you're going to become tamei with 2 re'iyos, then what? You're still going to become tamei with 3 re'iyos, because you can't see 3 without what? Without seeing 2 first. Ve'imar shtayim lekarban v'lo l'tumah, shalosh af l'tumah. Say maybe that 2 re'iyos doesn't generate tumah, just carbonic obligation. And ultimately, again, by 3 you get into the state of tumah, to which the Gemara says, Lo sachadaytcha desanya v'chipra alav hakohen lifnei Hashem mizovo. The pasuk says the kohen will atone for him before Hashem mizovo, from his zivos. Miktsas zavin mevi'in carbon, umiktsas zavin ein mevi'in carbon. It teaches us some zavin bring a carbon, some zavin don't bring a carbon. So I'll say, how do you say, what does that mean? Hakeitzad Ra shalosh maybe shtayim eno maybe. It means that if a zav has 3 riyos, he brings a carbon. 2 riyos, he doesn't bring a carbon. Oh, eno ela ra beis maybe. Ra shalosh eno maybe. Or maybe he'll say, if he has 2 riyos, he brings a carbon. 3 he doesn't. That doesn't make sense. Amrit ad shalo ra shalosh ra shtayim. Again, remember, you can't have 2 without. You can't have 3 without 2. So in other words, I will say what the Gemara is saying is, it doesn't make sense that 2 riyos would have a carbon, a function that 3 wouldn't have. It doesn't make sense. In this case, it's a carbon. It doesn't make sense to say 2 riyos would have a carbon, 3 wouldn't have a carbon. To which the Gemara says, it's trich Rabbi Simai, vis trich mizah. So I will say, in reality, we have 2 different limudim teaching us the same thing. Namely, that I will say, once you get to 2 riyos, remember again, there's a lot of commonality between 2 and 3, which is going to be what? Shiva Nekiyim, Mishkav Umoshav. What's going to be the difference between them is what? Is halacha l'maisa carbon. 2 has no carbon, 3 does have a carbon. So we'll say now we have 2 drushas teaching us the same exact thing. Because you would just have Rabbi Simai drasha hava minaki kushan. You would have asked the questions we asked before. Kamash malon mizavo. The mizavo lo yidana kamarios. Furthermore, again from zavo, I wouldn't know how many emissions we're talking about. Kamash malon Rabbi Simai. Beautiful. V'hashta da'am. So I'll say again, both drashas teaching us the same thing, just both being able to really offset the questions posed to the other. V'hashta da'amrit mizavo l'drasha. Now that we use mizovo for the drasha we just said above, v'chiyitar hazav mizovo my darashtabe. What do you do with the phrase v'chiyitar hazav mizovo? Hahu mibayle l'chidisanya. We need it for the following: v'chiyitar hazav l'chishiyivsok mizovo v'lo mizivo v'nigo. Both say this is actually very interesting. What happens if you have a guy who is both a zav and a metzora? This guy's got a lot going on over here, right? He's a zav and a metzora. So I will say, one would have thought that perhaps he cannot begin the purification process from his zivos while he's still a metzora. Because I will say, remember again, being a metzora, so saras is going to be our next sugya, right? Being a metzora, right? Contracting saras ultimately is a form of tumah. So you might have thought that if a guy is a zav and a metzora, and let's say he's ready to begin to undergo the purification process for his zivos, but he's still in a state of saras, you might have thought that he can't begin the purification process for his zivos. It's not true. The pasuk, the chiyitra azov, l'chishiyivsok mizovo v'lo mizovo v'nigo. Even if halacha l'mais, he's not ready to begin the purification process for his saras, but he is ready to begin the purification process for his zivus, he can begin to do so. Mizovo v'sipar, limer al zav bal shtei re'iyos shatan svira shiva. We learn from here that once a zav has 2 riyos, once a zav has 2 emissions, he has to count shiva nikiyim. V'halo dinhu imet hamei mishkavu moshav lo yitan svira shiva. So why do you need a special drasha to teach me that a zav who has 2 emissions has to count 7 clean days? I'll tell you, it's a simple limud. If you're tamei enough, we'll say, if you think about it, by the way, the tumah of mishkavu moshav is a very severe form of tumah. Because we'll say, what does that mean? Right? If you're metami mishkavu moshav, remember again, what was the example? You're sitting on a pile of cushions. What's the status of the pile of cushions? Right? They're all tamei. Which we'll say, if you think about it, it's pretty severe. That means you're conveying tumah to things that you don't even touch. If you're on that level, right, that intensity of tumah, that you're conveying tumas mishkavu moshav, the pashtos, you need 7 clean days in order to become tar. To which the Gemara says, it's not a good right. I'll tell you, Amud Beis. Shomeres yom kineged yom tochiach. The case of, now what's the case of Shomer Yom Keneged Yom? Take a look at the first Rashi on Chesamad Beis. This is Haroa Yom Echad Oshnayim B'soch Achad Asayom Shebein Nida L'Nida Mona Yom Echad V'Tavalas Bo. Let's listen to this. So very, very, very quickly, we saw this in Maseches Nida. If you remember again. From a Talmudic perspective, what's interesting is the way a woman's cycle is looked at in halacha is there are 11 days between each menstrual cycle, or 11 days, not between each, but 11 days between the time when a woman could become a nida. If she were to bleed during those 11 days, that's not called dam nidos, that's not called menstrual blood. Now what is it? Well, it depends how long it goes on for, right? During that time, if she bleeds, she could become a zava or a zava gidola if she has 3 emissions during that time. We're not going to get into all these halachas. Point over here is, if a woman bleeds during a time of non-nidos, a non-nida time, if she just has 1 emission, she is called a shomeres yom. Shomeres yom means she has to, for every day, for a day that she bleeds, she has to observe 1 day in purity. Right, one day, we'll call it in cleanliness. 1 day without an emission, and if she observes 1 day without an emission, then halacha l'maisa, she is restored back to her state of ritual purity. So Shomer Yom Keneged Yom Tochiach Shemitame Mishkav Moshav. So I will say she also conveys Tumas Mishkav Moshav. V'yet Eina Tu'una Sfiras Shiva. She does not go ahead and require 7 clean days. So both say the point over here is you see that what? A person could have a higher form of Tumah transmission, i.e. Mishkav Moshav, but yet not be obligated in counting 7 clean days. V'yaf ato al tetama al zeh, she'af api shemetame Mishkav Moshav, lo yitan svir shiva, Talmud lomar mizovo v'siper, mikzas zovo v'siper, limad al zav bal shtei re'iyos, Shaton Sfiras Shiva. Shabbos, I see you're right. So in other words, the argument to say that if you convey Tumas Mishkav Moshav, you automatically require Shiva Nikiyim goes out the window. Why? Because Shomer Yom Keneged Yom conveys Tumas Mishkav Moshav, yet she does not require Shiva Nikiyim. Therefore, the Gemara learns out from the pasuk that Allah Chalamaysa Zav, once he has 2 Rios, once he has 2 emissions, is going to convey Tumas Mishkav Moshav. And also what? Requires counting of Shiva Nikiyim. Both say first wide line, Chesamad Beis. Amavira Papa Labaye. So Papa said that Baye, Maishna Hai Mizovo, Dimirabi Bezov, Balshtei Re'ios. So we'll say from Mizovo, we're learning, right? We're coming to include that a Zov, who has 2 emissions, ultimately again is Chayiv and Shiva Nikiyim, and Mishkav Moshav. Umaishna Hai Mizovo, so let's listen to this. This is fascinating. Let's say we have 2 mizovos, right? From 1 mizovo, I'm coming to include that a zav who has 2 emissions has to count 7 clean days and conveys tumas mishkav moshav. Yet, from the second mizovo, this is riveting. From the second mizovo, I'm excluding a zav bal shtei re'ios from what? From karban. So I don't understand. How does that work? 1 mizovo includes, 1 mizovo excludes. What's the pshat? Amalei Isagad says, I'm sorry. Isagad hailemi utehu dasa lishta kramine. Because I will say if you think that the first zovo that we quoted, which is really the second one on the psukim, is coming to exclude the zav bal shtei riyos, don't say anything. Lishto kramine. V'chitema asya medina, and maybe you'll see we can learn it out from a logical argument. Shomeres Yom Keneged Yom Tochiach. He can't, because as we just saw before, Shomeres Yom Keneged Yom teaches you that even if you have the stringency of Mishkav Moshav, you don't automatically have Shiva Nikiyim. V'chitema haimi baile mizavo v'lo minig o. But we said before, maybe that zavo comes to teach me that if he's a zav and the Mitzora, you can begin the purification process for Zivus, even if he's still suffering from Tumas Tzaras. Imkin lichtov kra v'chiyithar hazav belishtok. Let the pasuk just say if the zav will become tar, and that teaches me that as soon as he's ready to go ahead and become tar from his zivos, he can begin that process, even if he is still suffering from Tumas Tzaras. Mizovo lamali. So why do I need the extra word mizovo? So the Gemara says limeid azav bal shtei re'ios. Shetaon Sviras Shiva, comes to teach us about a Zav, ultimately again, who has 2 emissions, that he is chayiv in counting of 7 clean days. And I both say, so the entire takeaway from this sugya, again, the simple takeaway, you learn a couple of interesting halachas. First of all, working backwards, you see a shomer yom keneged yom, which is a woman who has an emission during the non-nida time of the month. If it's just 1 emission, all she has to do is what? Count 1 clean day corresponding to the day she had an emission. But yet, interestingly enough, during that day she is metame, tumas mishkav u'moshav. We also learn that a zav who has 2 re'iyos is going to be chayiv what? Shivinikim, 7 clean days, and also metame tumas mishkav u'moshav. And a zav bal shalosh riyos, right? The zav who has 3 emissions, well, obviously, again, also shivinikim, mishkav u'moshav, but also has an obligation for what? For carbon. Incredible. Bosei Baiter, Mishnah, great sugyas. Ein bein mitzorah muskar, mitzorah mocha. Bosei, fascinating. So remember again, 2 different types of mitzorah. Now, Bosei, listen to this. Mitzorah muskar is a guy, ultimately again, who is confined, right? So right now he's in isolation. Why is he in isolation? Because he has something that looks like tsaras, but it's not definitive tzaras. So I'll say the easiest example of this is like this. If you have a situation where, let's say, you have a blemish on the skin that looks like tzaras, but let's say the hairs inside of that blemish haven't turned the same color as the blemish. So we have to wait and see. So what we do is, for certain situations, we tell a guy, isolation. You have quarantine, right? You have to quarantine until we see exactly what is going on. That is called a mitzorah muskar, a quarantined mitzorah. So in general, versus a mitzorah muchlat, which is a confirmed. Thank you, a confirmed mitzorah, right? Confirmed mitzorah. So there is no difference in a quarantined mitzorah versus a confirmed mitzorah, ela prio prima, except for the obligation ultimately to what? So I want to say priya and prima refer to allowing his hair to grow, right? Because the mitzorah does not take a haircut. And prima refers ultimately again to the tearing of the clothing. So priya is allowing your hair to grow. So we'll say a mitzorah mukhlar, a quarantined mitzorah, does not have these obligations. Doesn't have to allow his hair to grow, nor does he have to tear his clothing. But a confirmed mitzorah does. Right? Ela priya prima. Ein bein tarmito cheskel the tarmito chechlit. Ela taglachas v'tziparim. Similarly, so I will say if a mitzorah is quote unquote a mitzorah who is declared tahar after quarantine versus a mitzorah who is purified after a bona fide duration of tsaras, the obligation to shave and take a haircut, and a carbon of bird offerings. These are the distinctions. Today, Rabbi say what comes out is as follows. So halacha l'maisa, let's just talk a little bit differently. A confirmed mitzorah has an obligation to allow his hair to grow, to tear his clothing, and as part of this purification process, ultimately again he has to shave, take a haircut, and offer a carbon of birds. Versus a quarantined mitzorah, who essentially is it? See, I have to understand. A quarantined mitzorah is effectively what? A non-mitzorah. He's not a mitzorah. The difference is during his quarantine, he's treated like a mitzorah, but it turns out that he's released from quarantine because he's not a mitzorah. But during the quarantine period, he's kind of treated as a quasi-mitzorah. But during that time, he is not obligated to allow his hair to grow. He's not obligated to tear his clothing. And when he is allowed out of quarantine, because it turns out that he's not a mitzorah, halacha l'maisa what? There's no obligation of hair cutting, shaving, and certainly no karbanas. Says the Gemara, hal le'inyan shiluach zeh v'zeh shavin. So I'll say what you see over here is something very interesting, that regarding being sent out of the camp, that both of them are exiled. In other words, I will say the halacha is that by a mitzorah is sent outside of the wall of the city. So you see that whether you are a confirmed mitzorah or a quarantined mitzorah, if you're quarantining outside of the walls of this city as well. So in Hanimili, how do we know this? So the Tani Rav Shlomo Yitzchak Hamed Rav Huna v'tziara akoin mispachasi v'chibeis begada v'taher. So we'll say the pasuk says the Kohen shall go ahead and purify. And we'll say this is talking about the Mitzorah Muskar, the quarantine Mitzorah, right? So the Kohen will once remember. We'll say what happens is he has something that looks like tzara, so we quarantine him. We come back to him in a week. The Kohen looks again. The Kohen says, it's not tzaras, it's mispachas. What does he have to do? V'chibes v'gadav. He has to launder his clothing, right? Immerse his clothing. V'tier tahar mipriya uprima dmei kara. What it means to say is that halacha lamaisa tahar is a retroactive purification. He is tahar from ever having had to allow his hair to grow and his clothing to be torn. Amalei Rava, Shabbos is very interesting because vitaher, the Gemara is understanding to mean not on the present state, but on the retroactive state. The quarantine mitzorah was never obligated to allow his hair to grow and to tear his clothing. Amalei Rava elamiata gabe zov dichsev v'chibes begada vitaher. If that's the case, by zov it says he will immerse his clothing and he'll be tar. You're telling me that tar means retroactive purity? Hasam mai vitar me karika ella tar hashta meletame kli cheres behesik af agav da hadar chazi lo metame lemafreya. Both say what it means is that halacha lamaisa. If it turned out that the zav went ahead and moved something before his confirmed status, even when he's declared tamei, halacha lemaisa, that tuma is not retroactive. Hachenami tar hashta milatame bebiyel mafreya. So we'll have to stop over here for today. We'll pick up with this meditation tomorrow. But we're understanding what Rabbi say is interesting application or interesting drush of the word vitaher. The Gemara is understanding that the word vitaher by the mitzorah muskar, by the quarantine mitzorah, tells us he was purified from the beginning of the obligation of Priyo Prima, allowing his hair to grow and his clothing to be torn. In Meretz Hashem, we'll continue with the Sugya Meretz Hashem tomorrow. Shkoyach. Yeah, give me a call. Give me a call. Perfect.